I've wanted this gun for a long time, ever since I was a little kid. Made in Germany, 007 gun. Why would you not want this? Let's load it up and see how it shoots. Silencers sometimes get a bad rap. People want to pretend that it makes it easy to commit crime or something like that. But actually, shooting with a silencer just makes it a whole lot more pleasant to shoot, because you don't have to worry about giant ear protection. Wow. Whisper quiet. It's pretty cool. Made in Germany. It's very cool. Just a little bit warm. Oop, very hot. That's definitely a fun and quiet gun. The weirdest thing is just being able to sort of feel, because there's no sound, right? You just feel the bullet, hear it.
Oh man. Charles says that it's definitely not a weird sex thing going on at all with that guy. No comment. And let me guess, this guy is the GOP's next candidate for Senate Majority Leader. He's actually not, because he just lost. Jake, who is that?
That is Blake Masters, who is running for Senate in Arizona against the astronaut, Mark Kelly. The GOP had memes that were like, basically like the Chad Blake Masters versus the beta male astronaut, Mark Kelly.
Well, that was the best part about it, because they did, it was like just, it was just the typical, it was like the sort of like very basic Chad and beta male drawings, but the beta male drawing had the astronaut helmet on him, you know, really played on the public's like well-established contempt for astronauts, right? Like everybody hates those losers.
It's just like V, the documentary V.
Yeah. And then for some reason, you know, and it was like, and then the Chad was like, didn't even look like a Chad because he looked too much like Black Masters.
Yeah, which is Rick Scott in a wig.
Yeah, I have to say too, I'm glad Joe said what the fuck that was an ad. I cut it in a very specific, because it introduces him as a Senate candidate in the beginning with a little crayon, but I cut it just after that because anyone who can experience that not knowing what it is for like 2 minutes, only to finish with Blake Masters for U.S. Senate after the creepiest school shooter vibes, straight up school shooter vibes for 2 minutes. Also, like weirdly sexual ASMR, like, do you feel the bullet? Like no score, right? Like I saw someone on Twitter, unfortunately I can't attribute it, being like, hey Blake, what kind of score do you want for your ad? And it's like, no, I want them to hear just my breathing and the sounds of the gun. It's like, so Democrats did well, but Republicans maybe did them a few favors, right? At some point, it wasn't like we don't have to pretend like the Republicans were these genius masterminds this go around. I think Dems caught a few breaks. I'm not sure. Mark won pretty comfortably, so I'm not sure if a better candidate would have beaten him, but they didn't do their best, I guess.
Yeah, no, for sure. I mean, I think my take would be that it's much more that the Republicans lost than the Democrats won. I actually wrote something about this for the Daily Beast, which, that's the one. Democrats averted disaster, but the working class did not, which as far as like capturing the thesis of the article, I guess the title could have been better, but at least it gives you the list of topics that's going to be covered. So, so that's fine. But did beat the title. But in the article, I mean, I basically say, look, nobody should really be doing victory laps about this result because it's a weird, messy deadlock. Almost literally the exact status quo is preserved in the Senate. Either Warnock wins his runoff, in which case it's the mathematically the smallest actual majority you can get, 51 to 49, or he loses it, in which case we've got the exact numbers that we went into it with, which is 50-50, which is a sort of, which operates like a majority because you have Kamala Harris to break ties. And so that's, I mean, this is like one of those wars where, like, after the ceasefire, the final, ceasefire line is like 1 inch from where it started. Like it's that for elections. So it's definitely much more embarrassing for Republicans because they spent the last year reassuring everybody there was going to be a massive, Joe Rogan, have me on, Joe. You've been having too many conservatives. Said it was the red wave was going to be like the scene in The Shining where the elevator doors open and the blood gushes out. Not so much, right? So it's definitely more embarrassing. One might even say humiliating for the Republicans that they fell so short of the expectations that everybody, very much including them, had been building up for the last year. But it's also not really a victory for Democrats. It's just a weird tie. I mean, like the Senate, the ceasefire line in the Senate is pretty much where it started at the beginning of the war, with the Democrats having, keeping control by their fingernails the narrowest possible way. And they lost the House, although, they're kind of spraying champagne on each other because they didn't lose it by very much, essentially. I mean, we don't know that for sure. There's still enough races that haven't been called. But right now what's being projected is that it's probably going to be a Republican majority in the House that's like about as narrow as the Democratic majority in the Senate, like maybe literally like a 1-vote majority, which would be very funny. I really like the idea that Kevin McCarthy as Speaker is going to have to deal with a 1-vote majority and all the headaches that's going to entail for him. I really like how sad Charlie Kirk and Ben Shapiro both seemed at the end of the night. That's all great, but it's ultimately a weird, messy deadlock. And, I think Deb's averted disaster is the accurate thing they could say, right? They did avert disaster. They didn't lose the House by very much and kept the Senate about where it was. But, you do get the sense that the kind of electoral strategy they're pursuing is running on fumes. That like, this is, yet another narrowly averted disaster in a string of narrowly averted disasters, except the times like 2016 when disaster was not averted. And, God knows what's going to happen in the next cycle, the cycle after that. And it does seem like they're, especially because, this is not a hot take. I think this is pretty much actually boringly conventional wisdom, that the main reason that they were able to stave off disasters, well, the main 2 reasons are, 1, Republican overreach on abortion, and 2, Donald Trump is the Republican kingmaker right now, and he picked a bunch of like awful candidates who lost races that, maybe not in the Masters Kelly case, but in many others, they lost candidates they should, races they should have been able to win.
Yeah, I think, it's, averting disaster is a very good thing, right?
Sure.
And
yeah, I will take averting disaster over disaster every time.
Yeah, 100%. And I think that, it does need to be said that like Democrats did a lot better this midterm than the incumbent party normally would do,
Sure.
Has done in a midterm in a long time. But I think it's very difficult, like you said, to disentangle that from 2 things. One, Dobbs, right? And the other, the fact that the last fucking Republican president tried to like tried to like stage a coup,
Sure.
So I think, but to your point, the fact that Democrats could eke out a win in an environment in which Republicans have become so extreme is, it's like, we've become so inured to it that I think the fact that, Democrats were able to, in some, sense, avert disaster might feel like a victory, but it's a little bit scary that Republicans came so close to having, the House and the Senate in this environment in which the last president tried to stage a coup, which maybe has happened a little bit more sneakily, but like at this point, at least the optics of it, right, to the nation are a little bit more aggressive, and that they just overturned abortion at the Supreme Court. Like they're becoming that much more bold. So it was at least a relief to me to see. I take it, it's good, but with a grain of salt, that, like you said. And we need a message going forward.
Yeah, it's a huge relief, no doubt about it. Like, again, I will take averted disaster over disaster, but it is a very narrowly averted disaster. And it's also a little bit like, I would also push back just very slightly on the thing about, but like, every single time the party that's not in the White House gains a lot in the midterm, it's like, well, one, that's a tiny sample size, right? The number of elections you're actually talking about. And two, even in that sample size, there are a couple of big exceptions. 98 for the Republicans failing to do that, in 2002 for the Democrats failing to do that. So I mean, I don't really think that's a law of nature. That is something that usually happens. But again, like, given the range of ghouls and lunatics that the Republicans were running, and the fact that like even people who weren't the like most ostentatiously crazy, it's like the I don't know. I think about like that scene in Silence of the Lambs where Clarice is walking into the institution for the first time, and she passes by all the guys who are like jumping around and frothing at the mouth, and finally gets to Hannibal just standing there. It's like, okay, that the Hannibal just standing there at the end is Kevin McCarthy with his Commitment to America document. I interviewed Branko Marcetic about this on the Collins show just before the election, where he openly says that he wants to cut Social Security and Medicare, which are incredibly popular programs. And the fact that they narrowly averted that is pretty bad, right? I mean, like that's actually, that's very not good. Like, you should be able to, like, when people are openly saying that, you should be able to beat them by a lot. And so in the article, I kind of go into some of the reasons why I think they don't. What I see is like the biggest bright spot for the election, which is Fetterman Oz, because Fetterman had a stroke, and which led him to have auditory processing issues that were really easy to mistake for cognitive impairment. And B, he had like $100 million spent against him in attack ads. And he still, with those giant handicaps, he still outperformed Biden in pretty much every part of Pennsylvania. And I think that says something about, Fetterman is not perfect. I got my criticisms, but I mean, I think that says something about the effectiveness of that kind of left populist approach that he was using.
Yeah, I remember too when the K Hive was selling, talking about wanting Fetterman to drop out afterwards, after he had a stroke, because their guy lost. I don't think that other guy could have pulled out, eked out a victory with all the money being spent against him. I don't think it would have also been as high profile of a race, and I don't think Oz would have made some of those mistakes that he did. I also just I don't see the race turning out the same way if you just replace John Fetterman. So like,
no, I don't think so.
Very specifically that it had to be John Fetterman as the candidate.
Yeah. Hard agree. I think that I mean, to be fair, it might have also, I think it was a combination. The fact that he was able to pull it out as effectively as he did, I think is a combination of Fetterman being a very good candidate and Oz being a very bad candidate. I mean, I think if we're going to be scrupulous about this, it is both of those things. But I do think that it's, it is proof of concept for what Fetterman was doing.
Yeah, and I think when I was reading your article, Ben, I was thinking about the fact that Democrats are going to need a strategy going forward. And if we look at, let's say, like how election deniers did at this cycle, they didn't do very well, right? Mm-hmm. Like even in, as bad of a candidate as Oz might have been, for governor, the
Mastriano,
the Mastriano is just like not just an election denier, but crazy, right? And the Republicans didn't he just shared anti-Semitic memes for fun, and the Republican Party didn't support him. You know what I mean? So Oz, comparatively, especially institutionally, with all the funding behind him, was a much stronger candidate, right? And the point is that like eventually candidates that straight up flagrantly say, I don't give a shit about liberal democracy and we should basically, do whatever we want. That might not be popular with voters right now, right? But the sneakier way of doing that, right, of like being like a George Bush or something, like Republicans are eventually going to revert back to that, right? And we need something that can counter that. And I think they make it a lot easier for Democrats when they're just straight up saying, like, I don't care about liberal democracy and I'm going to get rid of it. And they're going to, by the fact that everyone's already trying to drop the Trumpian style of politics, I think they're going to move on from that and they're going to get much smarter and harder to beat, right? With much sicker candidates.
Yeah. So I guess I'll just say two things. One, I do think, I am happy that the crazy election deniers lost the Secretary of State races for the most part. That is very good. But I do think that this is one of the things I argue in the article, that the way that Democrats tried to make that an issue wasn't effective. There would have been a better way to do it. I'll just kind of lay down my marker on that and people can check out the article. But the other is, I'm glad you said that, because that is a good transition about liberal democracy. So let me just say, the second half of the show, we're going to be joined by historian, friend of the show, TMBS crew alumnus, Harvey J. Kaye, to talk about his book, The British Marxist Historians, which was just reissued by Zero Books. That's the book. He's also going to be staying with us for the post game, where we are also going to be joined by our prodigal producer, Cale Brooks. But don't worry, Jake is not being, replaced. I know he was worried about that, which is why he's clearly a little sick, and he still showed up tonight. But in any case, but before that, on the subject of people who are willing to just openly say that they want to get rid of liberal democracy, I recently did a debate in Chicago with a gentleman named Curtis Yarvin, in some circles better known by the name of his old blog, Mencius Moldbug. And I am going to show you just a little bit of that, and we're gonna break down a little bit of that before Harvey Harvey shows up for the second half. I think most of what's going on in this is more or less self-explanatory. I will say we did post on Friday the entire video of the 2 hours and change debate. There's also separate interviews that Thaddeus did with me and Curtis, which are, I think, just available to patrons at the Thaddeus's podcast unregistered. But the entire, again, 2.5 hours or whatever it was of the debate, you can watch. We either on unregistered or we reposted it here on Friday. But for people who haven't seen the whole thing, I will just say in general, so the topic of the debate was more or less whether the problem with America today is that we have too much democracy. That would be Curtis's position. We should just let benevolent elites govern us, or whether we have far too little, which is mine. And the things you will notice, I think, probably right away, that even though actually where I'm going to take you in right now is one of the least, is definitely one of the calmer moments of it. Like this is actually, like, the first part of this is actually relatively chill, but you will no doubt notice that I'm probably a lot more irritated than I usually am during these things, basically for two reasons. One, that Curtis is very bad at staying on topic and very fond of rambling historical digressions, that he often gets the history wrong. And two, like, sometimes stuff I'd read about really recently, so I could just immediately recognize, like, hold on. But two, he is very fond of this move, and I think you'll actually see during this part at least once, maybe a couple times when he does it, and like I get probably out of context way too annoyed by it. But that's because it's like these are like the 11th and 12th times he's done it over the course of the debate, where he sort of says, where he sort of retreats from actually trying to argue about things to just sort of being like, oh man, you're trapped in your narrative. Like he's a Reddit poster in 2013. You know, I mean, say what you want about Charlie Kirk, who was much better at sticking to the line of argument than this and the topic at hand. But that said, where we're going to come in right now is in it's not like the O'Keefe debate. It's definitely a more, you know, more sort of like low level annoying and less like whatever the hell that was. You know, but in any case, that's.
Did you say when this was recorded?
This was recorded actually the day before the LA live show. So
okay. So like Elon hadn't really taken over Twitter at that point.
That's true. That's true. Which
I just wanted, because you're wearing the same shirt. You know, people might be thinking it was earlier this afternoon. So I just wanted to make sure about that before.
Yeah, this is on purpose. That is the same shirt. This is the Honor Has Its Price shirt, which for people who aren't familiar with what that refers to, they can. That's about Daniel Muessig. So it's a callback to an article that the subject of an article I did for The Nation called "Will Biden Keep His Word and Pardon Federal Cannabis Offenders?" which since then he sort of did, but in a really half-assed way. Unfortunately, Daniel is still in prison. But this shirt was a fundraiser for this one particular cannabis prisoner, Daniel Muessig, who I've interviewed and I profiled for The Nation. And also, by the way, a reminder of some of what's at stake with the democracy discussion, because like an overwhelming majority of Americans want to federally legalize weed. And that's not happening. That's not happening because we don't have enough democracy. That's not happening because we have too much democracy, right? Let's put it that way. But so I actually, after this, I flew to LA that night, and then the live show was the next day. So this was a few weeks ago. Is when all this happened. But yeah, Curtis's position, depending on whether he's in Mott mode or Bailey mode. He'll either describe himself as a monarchist or just sort of say, well, we should have a really strong executive, which are really different positions. But in any case, so the reason that we're playing this is I think that this section gives you a lot of the sort of core disagreement that's underlying it, and and if you're just going to watch like one slice of it, maybe this is the one to watch. I guess actually last thing I should say is earlier, a surprising amount of the first chunk of the debate was spent arguing about the history of U.S. intervention in Latin America and whether Haiti is messed up because of culture or there's some ambiguity about Curtis's position on that, which would be his position. Or whether it has something to do with the last couple hundred years of being constantly fucked over by imperial powers, which is my position. So in any case, I think that's all the background you need for this. Let's watch some of this.
Go ahead,
I
Tori.
was just going to say, the one thing I have to say that is I think that there are plenty of people in power, and that's like even the powerful have a disinterest in reality, and that's why we can't even, border. I don't necessarily think we're that close to that, but also I think a lot of that has to do with their disinterest in engaging with reality because it might be less desirable than just a chill life or whatever.
Yeah. So part of what you said is that people have. That it shows that they too are disinterested in reality, and fair enough, right? But if we agree there's irrationality all around,
Sure.
Then what I need to hear next is a really good reason for thinking that elite irrationality is less worrying than popular irrationality, and then I think might have at least the beginnings of an anti-democratic argument.
Well, I think that there's, fortunately, if you're looking at, it's good because I feel like we've sort of arrived at some common ground in a way where we've basically admitted that there are sources of oligarchic elite error, as you say, and like I really like this skepticism of the Ukraine thing, because as far as I'm aware, your skepticism of the Ukraine thing is not really aligned with any particular movement or any particular authority. I think it's just your own personal opinion, and I think that that's like and it's out of step with what the New York Times wants you to believe, and I think
Trust me,
that's great.
very few beliefs I have line up with what the New York Times thinks.
And yeah, they're normally to the left of them, I would expect, but this one is not, because you're basically more pro-Putin than the average American.
Well,
and
I would push back against thinking
let's not descend into the weeds. Let's get to a point of agreement.
That makes you pro-Putin.
That was unfair.
I don't think being against the war in Iraq.
That was an unfair jab, and I retract the remark. I want to say that basically, I think when we look at these two systems or forms of power, one of them which we could call oligarchical progressivism, and the other one of which we could call democratic populism, we agree that there are significant structural flaws with both of these ways of governing mankind. And that's why it's so unfortunate that there are only two possible systems of government: democracy and oligarchy.
No, for sure. As you point out, labor unions that could actually protect people's free speech rights, actually give them a living wage, etc., and actually are starting to have many of these benefits from people who are organizing them now. That's anachronistic. We need to go with cutting edge new ideas like monarchy.
Okay, absolutely.
All right, right here in the front.
Great, thanks. Okay. For you, Ben, you talked earlier about universal basic income, and you were talking about how if you work for an employer, your free speech rights are restricted. Certainly true, you can't say anything sometimes, and whatever you want. Sometimes you have to say exactly what they say in particular job circumstances. But then you overlay the intersection of UBI and democracy, and you start giving everybody money. There's no world that I can see of, and I think this is just a lack of imagination. I think this is human nature, where those people who are controlling that money are not also controlling behavior. And maybe that's being done democratically. It's democratic, but just like the aunt of Thad, who ultimately wanted something for their money, the government or whoever is controlling that money is going to want something out of those people. If this was a year ago and we had UBI, you would not be able to get it if you were unvaccinated. Whatever the popular democratic feeling is at the time against any particular ideology, those people are going to be shut out.
Well, this is very testable.
They will be shut out. Democracy will work against truly UBI. So how do those work?
You're really good at restating their question.
Sure. Sure. So the question was going back, and I'm not sure when people are actually watching or listening to this, if they'll have all seen our previous discussion. So earlier during my solo with Thad, he was talking about his aunt who gave him these like very generous gifts of money when he was like, whatever, starting when he was like 12 or 13 or something. And, and he'd get like $100 gift from his aunt, and he was excited about it. But then, then like he'd kind of have to pick up the phone when his aunt called, and then she'd start like objecting to his behavior, and you should be smoking weed and all that, right? So is this a good metaphor for a more expansive welfare state, essentially, the kinds of universal social programs that I would support? And the questioner connected that discussion up specifically with whether if we had UBI, then that would be that would be changed to a NUBI, non-universal basic income. There would be conditions.
In the context, especially of democracy, and not a strong man who could like hold the line.
Yeah, the strong man would actually be able to impose conditions. It'd be much harder for democratically elected politicians to, and I can explain why in a second. But so the suggestion from the questioner, again, just for people watching or listening later, was that specifically last year, you would have been denied it if you weren't vaccinated. Now, I point out a couple things about this. because I think it's much better when there is empirical evidence that's available to go with that instead of just speculating about what sounds to us like what would happen. So Alaska, for example, actually does have a small UBI, the Alaska Permanent Fund, which is a just bizarrely socialistic thing that exists in Alaska of all places, from their oil drilling, that everybody gets sent a check. Far as I know, there are Alaskans here who can correct me, that was not conditioned on vaccination last year. Now, you can say, well, maybe that's Alaska. Maybe that's because of the politics of the state. So now we can start to ask questions about other countries that have various sorts of universal state provision of services. Were Canadians who didn't? Sure. No, go for it. Just keep in mind before you say this that I'm going to have to repeat it before I respond to it, because people are not going to hear you.
Okay, so I'm one of those people who moved from Canada to Florida, to the glorious Republic of Florida 2 years ago, in very large part to get away from what was happening there with the COVID lockdowns and whatnot. And there was the denial of medical service to the unvaccinated and a lot of other stuff that went around with it. So the popular will there was way, way, way more aligned with the pro-vax thing than it was in the US. And what you saw was that manifested itself specifically in policy and in denial of service to certain people under certain conditions. Everything from directly from operations not being done to people who weren't able to visit their loved ones in the hospital because they weren't vaccinated.
Yeah, so there are two very different things that are being grouped together there, and I think it's important to make a distinction. So what the questioner said when he came back in is that he's from Canada, and he moved to Florida because he doesn't like the COVID policies in Canada, and there was a claim about denial of medical services, and there was a claim about people not being able to visit hospitals because that was seen or claimed to be whatever unsafe because of concern about the spread of COVID, was specifically when they're unvaccinated. That was the question, and I would say that I think we'd have to have a bigger discussion about this, but certainly one thing that and please just correct me briefly, right? So I don't have to repeat a bunch of stuff if I'm wrong about this, right? But it's not the case that there was a law passed in Canada saying you're no longer eligible for Canadian Medicare in general if you're not vaccinated. I think what you're talking about are specific policy, specific hospitals saying we've made a determination that it's not safe to do this at this time because it's not medically urgent, and there's this risk that goes with it, because we're concerned about the spread of COVID, which is a very different thing. And then really to connect it back up with Thad's Thad's aunt, and the larger issue about welfare states and personal freedom. If you have a private hospital that is especially in a more laissez-faire environment, less regulation, man, they could go way further in that direction if they wanted to. And there's a reason why you're not getting that law saying oh no, Canadian Medicare is no longer universal. This social insurance only applies to people who've been vaccinated, because even in a context where those COVID policies you don't like were actually fairly popular, in the broad mass of Canadians, including, by the way, the majority of Canadian truck drivers, but even in that context, that would have been wildly unpopular. It would have been really hard to get away with that because of the level of popular opposition that provokes, because once you've got those universal programs in place, as people with other politics may bemoan, it's really, really, really hard politically to take them away, which I would celebrate. And I just say, look, if you're worried that if we had the America Permanent Fund instead of the Alaska Permanent Fund, that would be made contingent, I would just point out how much harder it is to change a well-established social program and end its universality. How much harder that is than your boss just saying, you know what, I'm sick of you, you're fired. So if you're worried about Thad's aunt private employers, private charity, private sources of funds are going to be a way bigger concern about depending on people's whims and how they can, give and take away than things that you get as a universal right of citizenship.
So can I interject a little? Sorry.
Yeah, you can. Go ahead.
So there's always this equation that I see in your reasoning about democracy, and especially democracy and bureaucracy, that it always seems that the things that you like are democratic and the things that you dislike aren't. And so when we look at these specific kinds of policies in Canada, you're absolutely right that these policies are not carried out by these sort of symbolic elected arms anymore. Oh no, they're done by permanent commissions. And they're done nationally by permanent commissions. And so the question of basically what sort of the kind of we must enforce vaccination kind of hysteria over the last year or two is, I think, very interesting, because it certainly didn't come from popular enthusiasm. It became a popular enthusiasm in some quarters. It became a popular enthusiasm in quarters that are basically very NPR listening quarters, you might say. And the way in which basically that side of the, do you remember the amazing flip in like public versus elite opinion about COVID that happened in February 2020?
No.
Do you remember how in like basically through all of February, the message was like, what you really should be worrying about is the flu. Don't be a bigot. Go to Chinatown and lick doorknobs.
Yes.
And then Donald Trump, stupid Trump,
You-
changed his mind and was like,
You need
oh,
to
no,
read more
if-
leftists. You'd be surprised
if
how many
this-
people are pointing that out.
if this-
Just like with the Ukraine, you'd be surprised how many leftists think that.
And you can point that out. The meaning of that is sort of kind of extremely dark and disturbing in a way, because basically this policy effectively was left up to the whims of Donald Trump. Because if Donald Trump had come out and instead of saying, oh no, if COVID is real, the stock market will go down and I won't get reelected, if he'd instead come out and said, General Jack D. Ripper style, we must preserve America's precious bodily fluids, you can guarantee that American elite opinion would have followed basically the Swedish path. And I think that and it's remarkable even that Sweden's own bureaucracy followed a path that was out of step with basically global elite opinion. That was remarkable. And sort of, kind of an interesting case of sort of the exception that proves the rule in some ways. But the whole world, just like they went mad for George Floyd, went basically mad for, let's take the anti-Donald Trump position.
All right. So before it goes on to the next thing, Andy actually has some facts about Canadian COVID policy.
Yeah. First of all, there is no actual policy about denying patients. That's actually there's a class action lawsuit happening because it has happened with individual doctors. According to a global article I found from last year, in New Brunswick, less than 5 times people were denied because of this. Nova Scotia, 1 or 2. British Columbia, 0 formal complaints, but have heard concerns from patients. Alberta does not track this data. Quebec and Manitoba, Saskatchewan, and Prince Edward Island cannot disclose. Ontario, 68 complaints and concerns for the last 3 months, includes unavailability of in-person care, not necessarily due to vaccination status. Now, as an add-on to this, people have had things shifted around because of safety concerns, which is part of what these complaints are. Like, say, this procedure is happening. We don't quite have. We're not satisfied with your safety in this procedure. We need to reschedule, and that's where some of these complaints are coming from. This
is incredible. So
yeah.
So I think I added up those figures in my head. I know there's some provinces that don't collect this. So we heard I think that's about 75 complaints, and what you just listed off. That's let's assume that it's let's assume that the provinces that don't collect that information, that it's way higher rates than the provinces that do. So let's go nuts. And let's say that that's like a sixth of the total. It's like 300 people have complained about this in some way. That's out of a nation.
There's not even 300 people in like the Northwest Territories or none of it, or some of these places.
Yeah. Some of these places probably have less than that, but yeah, not literally, but I mean very small places. Population.
I mean,
size.
large land-wise, just population-wise, tiny.
Yeah, exactly. So that's out of a nation of 30 million people. So Curtis is making it sound like the commissions are imposing some sort of national policy. And what you're talking about is individual doctors making determinations about what they think is safe and not safe, which let's even say they're bad determinations. Let's say that they're being way too paranoid and the cost benefit analysis didn't work at all. It's like, okay, whatever. You're still talking about individual doctors. And this is supposed to, this is supposed to show that if we had UBI, it would be taken away for people who weren't vaccinated. Even though, as Jake points out, stimmy checks went out to the vaxxed and the unvaxxed alike, when it was voted out, by Democrats. It's just such a weird leap, right? It's like, no, as a matter of fact, unvaccinated people still have access to Canadian healthcare because it is a legal right. It would be illegal to say that, we're going to deny someone healthcare in Canada until they do what we want or whatever. A doctor can say, I don't think this particular procedure is safe, right? It's not urgent enough, and my safety concerns about the spread of COVID in the hospital are too great or whatever. But equating that with non-universality.
Well, he also lumped in with not getting certain medical procedures, like not visiting your family in a hospital, which during COVID, if you're unvaccinated, which is obviously very different, right?
Those are two completely different issues.
At a certain point, you get to people that clearly just don't believe in COVID.
Anywhere too, there were problems with people not being able to see loved ones in places, people not setting up they were slow, not as slow as we were here, but they were still slow on the on dealing with things in Canada. So.
Yeah, no, sure. I'm just saying it was very biased.
None of this has, it obviously is lumping together, both the questioner and Curtis are lumping together wildly different issues and making claims that are just totally out of touch with reality. You have an entire pretty big, population province, and you have 5 people who have made some sort of complaints that they were denied something by the decisions of individual doctors. That doesn't mean they were declared ineligible for Canadian Medicare. That is a really good intervention. Let's watch a little bit more.
In early March of 2020. And I think that there are, in some ways cases to be made for both perspectives. I'm kind of a COVID moderate, which I know is very unusual in this group. But I think the dynamics of where that elite opinion came from tell us a lot about basically the flaws in essentially elite governance. And I think that agreeing with you that there are really systemic flaws in elite governance, and there are really systemic flaws in unfettered, uncontrolled, unmanaged public opinion is I think an important point of agreement between us. And I don't want to let that form of agreement slide. And I think that understanding, sort of building more of an understanding of why elite governance goes wrong. I don't know how you feel about the lab leak theory, but I'm a believer in that as well. It wouldn't surprise. Do you believe in the lab leak, or do you believe?
I'm not sure.
Yeah, I'm not completely sure, but even to be not sure is great. And because there are very few elite sources of opinion telling you to be not sure. There's some great articles in Vanity Fair actually about the lab leak. But most journalists on the science beat are captive to the virology community. And the virology community basically doesn't want people to know that like this was a gain of function experiment that got out of control, or at least even that it was possible that it was a gain of function experiment that got out of control.
As you know, right? Again, I think that the way, one of my sort of bigger picture beefs with a lot of what you say is that, the way you use terms like left and right tends to be, I think, about cultural attitudes, often much more so than it's about what politics, I think, is most fundamentally about, which is distribution of power and the distribution of material resources. So then, when it comes to something like the New York Times, because you see that as the left, then, you're surprised when I disagree with them. But look, I mean, like Noam Chomsky, who's come up a couple times in this conversation, there's a story you can find on YouTube, both Christopher Hitchens and Gore Vidal telling the story about Chomsky at the dentist, where he's told his dentist asked, "You grind your teeth?" He says, "I don't think so." Right? And he asks his wife, Miss Chomsky, does he grind his teeth like in the night while he's asleep? She says, "No, I don't think so. I've never noticed that." And they can't figure it out until the next morning. She realizes that he grinds his teeth in the morning while he reads the New York Times. Because it pisses him off so much, right? I don't like the New York Times. I like, and I know you read this article because you brought it up on the Young Turks. I like Current Affairs, right, where my friend Nathan Robinson, put out a big thing about this. That's one of the reasons, that
I really respected that Nathan Robinson piece, and he's also a very snappy dresser. And,
no comment on that one.
I think we could all take a leaf from Nathan Robinson's page there, and he dresses like Disraeli, in fact, and it's so good. And so sort of whenever you find kind of the light of independent thinking burning, and there are ways in which it can sort of burn in this like sort of fatally flawed, like kind of very historically cliched leftist perspective, and sort of explode out of that in beautiful ways. And like, one of the ways in which you see these kinds of beautiful explosions of independent thought are very like Nathan Robinson being like, no, actually, I'm going to think for myself on this thing. And once I think for myself, it's obvious what's going on. And
so can I, if I promise this really is a question, this is not a statement. Yeah. Can I just ask okay. Yeah. So brief question, right? Because you spent all this time talking up the values of things that I also care about curiosity, about independent thought, about, standing outside of established narratives, all of which would make me think that, that you'd be a big fan of free speech, diversity of perspectives, all of that stuff. So does it seem to you that in dictatorships, monarchies, that those tend to be things that in which free speech and a wide variety of views tend to flourish more than they do in democracies?
That's an excellent question. And I think that if you read Tocqueville, for example, Tocqueville, people are like, oh, cancel culture. This is the thing that, was invented in like 2012 or something. Tocqueville in Democracy in America describes it almost perfectly in the 1830s. And he describes basically democratic America as the place in the world that had the least free speech. And I think that's absolutely true. If you basically look at, for example, the latitude of political opinion that you could express in, let's say, France in 1770, it's wildly greater than the latitude that you can express today. In fact, the latitude of opinion, there are many things you could say in America in 1850 that you can no longer say. And so, to me, when I basically look at, sort of democracy in the sense that we have it today, no, I feel that the range of perspectives within the entire Overton window is incredibly narrow on a historical perspective, and the way in which it looks large to us. And this is sort of why I've sort of been kind of encouraging you to kind of just go wild and go into the Google Books world and go outside the kind of the world of that bubble, because just read any book from the 20s. You'll find all kinds of crazy ass weird shit.
For a minute there, you were actually having a conversation about the ideas instead of retreating into this smug
That's
Reddit
amazing.
shit where it's like, oh, open your mind and, you know, and receive the
We
truth.
were just talking about
As
opening our minds. And it's like, and then when I sort of show you how to actually do it, you're like horrified.
Oh my God, Curtis, you cannot be this
All right.
fucking dumb about this. They have this is not, I'm not horrified by it on Google Books. I am sad and disappointed that you're wasting time in what could be a useful conversation doing this posturing about, oh, see, you're trapped in narratives. I've realized the truth.
Which is why we're going to go to the questions right here.
Want to play like 5 more minutes after this, but I do want to just pause to say, one, that really is like the 12th time he did that. But two, that this idea, I mean, I should have pushed back on the thing about the, you know, you could say more in France in 1770 than in, you know, democratic America and Tocqueville's visiting. If you said the wrong thing, you know, in France in 1770, where there was a police spy who could hear you, you know, you would literally be imprisoned for it, right? If you said like, we shouldn't have a monarchy. But also, I think the maybe more substantive point there is just to note that he is equating 2 or 3 wildly different things here. One is how free people feel to say things that people in power might disagree with. Like, in other words, are you worried that you're going to get fired from your job? Are you worried that you're going to be put in prison? Are you worried about neither one? Are you worried about something else? With sort of some fuzzy notion of like social acceptability. And he's also, which of course every society, you know, that's ever existed or will ever existed, there are taboos, there are things that are more or less, you know, that there are things that people will look at you funny for saying, you know, or won't. That's not really what the free speech issue is about. The free speech issue is about power. Who has the power to actually do something to you because of what you say. And then the related point, before I throw to you guys real quick, is just this, that what he's also equated the question of the range of things you can say, which, by the way, way wider now than in 1850. Are you fucking kidding me? You know, like, but he's equating the question of the range of things you could say with there being specific things that at various points in the past you could say without people looking at you funny, that now you can't say without people looking at you funny, right? Like, for example, in 1850, I think we should have slavery was a mainstream opinion, and now it's not a mainstream opinion, which, you know, is good. But that doesn't mean there's a narrower range of things you could say. It just means that like which things are taboo and which things aren't is historically specific. It's going to be different in different times and places.
Yeah, I mean, it's without something more concrete, like, hey, look, here's a law of what you were allowed, you know, of things you were allowed to say at a certain time, or here's a law on the books that said you weren't allowed to speak about, let's say, communism, right? It just devolves into this like vibes type of argument where like you like, yo, if like he's basically like, I was there, man, in the 1770s, like you could say whatever you want, bro. And now like if you so much as say that maybe you shouldn't get vaccinated, bro, like I feel like it's just such a weird vibes argument, and it just is very uncompelling to me because like my gut is just, I mean, it's not just a gut feeling, it's a true feeling, right? That like he's saying, for example, like now we even have less freedom of speech, right? Like in America, like there are times when like, what about like in, you know, all of the times that like socialists have been so incredibly censored in America. Like, I'm not saying things are amazing now, but there are times like, you know, where you'd be blacklisted from Hollywood if you even said that you're a socialist. You know, now there's like socialists on Saturday Night Live. It's not really, obviously, I'm just really wondering where he's getting this, like, you know, oh, group think, all libs think the same. It seems pretty ridiculous to me. So my vibes don't align with his vibes, and so he's gonna have to show me some concrete evidence to change my mind. You know?
Yeah, I mean, it's also like, look, if you are, I mean, I don't know if he actually literally does, but it kind of feels like he does. If you like live in Brooklyn and you hang out in certain sorts of, you know, progressive leaning kind of social circles, which it basically seems like Curtis does, then yeah, sure. That's then the vibes you'll get is like, man, this is, you know, that the stuff I think really shocks people, but you know, whatever. Like they're members of Congress who say this stuff, right? Like, you know, there are lots. The vibes are very different depending on who you run with. Is what I'm saying, and I think that in particular, that, you know, again, I think you're right. I mean, I would make a few more distinctions. That's like, okay, if we have vibes on this end and laws on this one, then it's like, okay, stuff like the Hollywood blacklist, which is privately owned studios making that between themselves, some government pressure, but it's not exactly legally mandated, or even just like lots of employers will fire you if you say something, whatever. I'm a socialist. I take that seriously as a power issue, right? But it's like, those are issues about power, not issues about what people are going to dislike you if you say, right? That it's like, yeah, sometimes I don't know what to tell you, man. Like sometimes people are going to react badly to things like that's just, you know, like that is just the nature of the beast. But I do want to running just a little bit behind. I do want to bring on Harvey in a minute. So let's watch the last little part of this.
Okay, so I got 2 questions, one for each, if that's okay.
Sure.
Okay.
2 questions, one for each. Go ahead.
Ben, you talk big democracy proponent. You talked about polls a bit. Curtis thinks polls are fake, in that it's a way to manage democracy. Do you think we live under a managed democracy?
Mm-hmm.
Or I guess, like, can you kind of
The question is to Ben is, do you think we live in a managed democracy?
Right.
Yeah, and the setup to that question was about
polls?
me talking about polls and Curtis thinking polls are fake.
I didn't say that exactly, but
Not in that. It's
No.
I said it more fast because I'm a simple thing. Curtis, you know, Ben thinks we should help, or Haiti would be improved by like raising the minimum wage. Do you think Haiti would be improved by improving the population stock through a sort of eugenics program?
Does Curtis think?
Man, I'm super curious about that. Curtis should go first.
There's actually
wait. The question is, because we've got to make sure we get this recorded. The question is, Curtis, do you think Haiti would be improved by introducing a
Sort of
eugenics to improve the human stock, the population stock?
I'm not really a big believer in population replacement in general. And when I think of Haiti, when I think of a place, I think of a people, really. And, you know, sort of the idea of like improving Haitians by making them non-Haitian doesn't really make any sense to me. The question I would ask instead is, you know, one of the things I find in all pre-modern political thinkers is this belief that the Constitution has to be fitted to the country and its people, especially obviously the people and not the geography. Because I think, you know, if you move the Japanese nation to Haiti, I think they do perfectly fine. And so the question of what sort of governance the actual people of Haiti need, I think, is somewhat unanswered. I think it doesn't look like anything like what they have now, and also don't really think it looks particularly like Norway. I would love to see Ben be dictator of Haiti for like 2 or 3 years. I think that would be absolutely informative.
I think if you think that
you could just listen to public opinion.
That I think that that is how anything I want in Haiti could come about. Man, you have not paid attention for the last couple hours.
I don't think that could come about, but I'd still like to see it. I think it would. I
would like to hear you explain your views about this to Haitians. I think that'd be fascinating.
No, I think that actually, if you go, one of the things that I love doing is I love talking to immigrant Uber drivers, and it's
Man, you and
surprising.
Tom Friedman.
It's
that's
like
a-
surprising how much their perspective of their own country differs from the perspective that you get from reading the New York Times. If you
oh
ask
my God,
most people,
Curtis, you don't listen.
if you ask, no, because the thing is, to me, like your New York Times thing is, you're like, no, I follow the Utney Reader instead, and like,
Jesus
you know,
Christ.
my grandparents.
I barely know what the Utney Reader
my
is.
grandparents
Does
were.
it the Utney Reader? You know, just is the Washington Post part of the cathedral? They just called for
it was
for
the
US,
it was the current
U.S.
affairs of its
intervention in
day.
Haiti.
No. I mean, my grandparents were American communists, so I recognize this line of discourse very, very well. And
No idea what that's supposed to mean.
they never used the word communist to me. They would always say progressive. And so you know, when I basically like lump together, one of the things that's very irritating when you talk to leftists is, you know, you'll basically be ascribe some policy to like the Popular Front of Judea, and they'll be like, no, that's a policy of the Judean Popular Front. We're totally against the People's Front of Judea, right? You know, and sort of that's kind of the, like, when I use the New York Times as a metonym for sort of the whole space of intelligent opinion. You know, I realize that you object to being included in that.
Yes, you're right. It is irritating to leftists when you say things that lump together things that are at opposite extremes, fail to make basic distinctions because they would fuck with your worldview. They are very much. They are very much so small. They are very much.
They look very, very different.
They are very much at opposite extremes, and certainly on the question of views towards American foreign policy. Again, there's a reason that the New York Times makes Noam Chomsky, grind his teeth. If you read Chomsky and Herman, Manufacturing Consent, which is where everything that's plausible and what Curtis says about the cathedral comes from. If you read that, I think he is very on point about the ways in which Cold War anti-communism certainly shaped the space of political discourse that could be allowable in the New York Times, about how certain reflexive assumptions about American foreign policy did, and certainly about the relationship between the thing that he never wants to talk about, which is the actual power centers in American society, which are not journalists and academics at all, right? Those are hired hands. Pete, the actual power centers in American society are people who own that stuff. And no, what they want, I think, differs just a little bit more. I think that what corporate oligarchs who own media want is not particularly what I want. And if you think the difference between corporate oligarchs getting everything they want and democratic socialism is a difference between the Popular Front for the Liberation of Judea and the Judean Liberation Army, or whatever the hell the Monty Python line is, I would just respectfully submit that you're not thinking about it very carefully. All right. There you go. That's a good sample of what that debate was like.
When is he debating Pascal?
I would pay to see that debate. I would like, even if I couldn't see it in person, I would do the pay-per-view.
Yes.
Like if there's a thing like a bar where people can see it.
Jason, make this happen.
Please. That would be amazing. I should also say real quick before we go to Harvey that I had an article that in Compact, I had an article about the Washington Post calling for U.S. intervention in Haiti that I actually wrote the day after the debate. Because they'd asked if I would write something about that, and I thought that after that I was like, okay, I really want to write this now. And I in the article, it's actually here. I'll get the screen share real quick. But in the article, I go through the whole history and just sort of trying to blame it on whatever genetic cultural bullshit that that Curtis wants to blame current conditions on Haiti on. I love that argument that, well, pre-modern thinkers all thought this. It's like, yeah, man, modernity, it's a good thing, right? That we're much smarter now than we know a lot more about the world than pre-modern thinkers do. The expansion of science, is really good for this. That people have a better grasp on how causation works in the real world, and don't slip into quite as much to lazy bullshit magical thinking about national character. But in the article, I go through the whole history, quickly of the ways in which actually this is a good quiz question here. If you guys had to guess, so as I'm sure you might have both heard, or might remember actually from when Pascal was on the show talking about it, when Haiti finally, the successful slave revolution that got them independence from the French, when that was finally resolved, part of the peace agreement, so the French would then leave them alone, is that they had to pay reparations, not the kind of reparations people argue about now, but the other way around, right? Reparations to the slave owners, right? Reparations to France for all the lost property of French citizens in the revolution, mostly human property. If either of you guys had to guess, when did Haiti finally finish paying off that debt?
Something like 1942 or something like that.
That is very close.
I was gonna guess like yesterday because
it's not quite it's not quite yesterday, but it is 1947. So Andy still didn't quite get it. It's 5 more years more recent than
Andy.
that.
Wow, that is what a dumb guess, Andy.
I know.
5 years off.
He should be very embarrassed, but yeah, 1947, which is about a decade before the U.S.-backed right-wing dictator Papa Doc Duvalier came in. So if there's a place where, where Haiti, like that, that's not very much breathing room between those two things, to put it mildly. The first president after the Duvaliers were finally ousted by a popular uprising. The first democratically elected president after that was literally, there was a coup that by people who at least had links to the CIA. There's a lot of debate about whether the CIA, knew about it, in advance. U.S. actually restored him, but then literally U.S. Marines escorted him out of the country. He says he was kidnapped in 2004. His political party has been excluded from a bunch of subsequent Haitian elections. The last unification president was killed by assassins who seemed to have a lot of ties in Miami. And the U.S. very strongly backed the new president, who's still refusing, last I heard, to hold elections. So I think if you have a view about how Haiti's dystopian levels of poverty and economic inequality came to be, that doesn't assign a starring role to imperial meddling, then I think you're huffing fairy tales. But in any case, I'm going to have a much more pleasant conversation about history with our good friend Harvey J. Kaye. So Jake, I will see you next week. Jake is, as you can tell, still resting up from the flu. Andy, I will see you in the postgame with Harvey and Cale. And now we are going to bring in. Actually, this is a fun fact. The name of this show is due to Harvey J. Kaye. That he had back in the summer of 2020 when I was first starting the show, and I asked him if he wanted to appear on the first episode. He asked what I was going to call it. I gave a suggestion. He was like, it's not very good. You should just call it Given an Argument. So that is because of Harvey. But it has been too long since you've been on the show. How are you doing, my friend?
I'm doing okay. It has been a long time. There was one other time, was that actually the time we talked about Debs for a while? Was that
you've been out a few times, but it's but it has been a while. So I think the first time the first time was in the very first episode of the show. Then the second time you did talk about Debs with me and Sean Goody, and then there was a third time when I actually had to. There's a family situation. I couldn't be here, and you and Cale filled in together.
That's right. Yeah. Wow.
Yeah. So, Charles, the original idea was logic for the left, and Harvey was like, "Nah, don't say logic. That's this is gonna."
It's funny. The word that's funny because the word logic obviously fits you very, very much. But I just thought maybe you don't want to reduce it to that.
Yeah. No, it was a good instinct, but yeah, I wanted to have you back now, both because it's been too long, and also because your book, which I believe is actually your very first book. I remember years and years ago when I was teaching at Rutgers, getting it out of the Rutgers library to take a look at it, and I posted a picture of the library book. And I think you told me that was your first, that was your very first book, and it is this book.
As long as the book, I wrote the book 40 years ago. Okay, how's that for a thought? I mean, are you like 40 years old yourself? Wait a minute.
I am 42. So there you go.
Okay, but you got the idea. And the book first came out in the winter of 84, 85. And I was fortunate. It remained in print for a long time. And then another publisher bought the book again. And it was the first publisher was Basil Blackwell Polity Press. Neither one of the Polity Press still exists, right? Then in the mid 90s, the second edition with the Hobsbawm forward came out with Macmillan, which was, or at least has been, St. Martin's in this country. And then, in order to accord our dear friend, our late dear friend Michael due credit, it was in a conversation with Michael during one of the breaks or between the show and a post game, where he said that I asked him if he was working on anything, and he talked about Zero Books, both of our publishers now. And I produced a collection of my essays for them, take hold of our history. And then Doug Lane had talked about the possibility with me of bringing out yet again, because the rights had reverted to me, of this book, The British Marxist Historians. So if anyone picks it up, they'll see that it has 3 prefaces: 84, 96, I guess it is, and then 2021, 2022. Yeah, it's just daunting. I had to reread the book in order for it to come out. And I have to say, I don't know if you'll appreciate it in the same way that I'm going to say this, but I didn't realize how analytical once upon a time I was. And I don't know if it's my age or just because history made me sort of tune me into a whole different set of ways of thinking. I'm just not quite as analytical as I was at that time in any conscious and deliberate way.
Yeah, well, of course I like that, but about the book, but yeah, this is. I want to get into the meat of some of what you say in it, of course, but I also think I also do want to just talk a little bit about how you got into the subject originally, right? I mean, because I think, if I'm remembering correctly from other interviews I've seen with you, I think you started out studying Latin American.
Yeah, almost all 3 of my degree as a high school exchange student in South America, and it just fascinated me. And my undergraduate degree was in history. My graduate degree is basically in politics, international politics, at the University of London. And there I had a minor subject in agrarian studies, and the fellow the title he had was lecturer, but that would be like an assistant professor in this country, who was decidedly a Marxist. And one day he said to me, you know more about Latin America than any of our British students do, but you don't know how to make an argument. Okay. And I said, what do you mean? And he goes, well, he said, you're not thinking theoretically in any way. You're not bringing questions to bear on things. And he gave me an assignment for the long break in winter, the Christmas holidays, and had to do with, are Latin American rural workers, are they proletarian or peasant? Simple question. And based on land tenure studies that were done. And that was the beginning, especially after that, where I really came to understand what I was looking at in, for lack of a better way of putting it, Marxian terms. And and then I actually left and I did my PhD. When I came back to the States, I ended up going from LSE to LSU, and at Louisiana State University, I was in a sociology program, and I did Latin America as my overall thesis and or dissertation in this country. But what was interesting is that I didn't quite know how to. I was using terminology that was seemingly Marxist, but it was based on Andre Gunder Frank's work on dependence theory on Latin America, which it was an attack on the more traditional modernization kinds of stuff I knew with dual society and all that. And this was the age in which modern world systems emerged. And it's a funny little story. If anybody's doing any graduate work themselves, they might get a kick out of this. I had gone to Mexico in the summer of '75, and I, as a graduate student, and took undergraduates to Mexico to study. And when I came back, I had a new office mate, and a guy who I became very, very good friends with. And he was hearing what I was saying to him about what I was working on for my dissertation. This is, again, I was pretty sure it was summer '75. Or anyhow, he says to me, "So what does exploitation mean?" I was using this term. What does that mean? And my answer was so fucking inadequate, absolutely inadequate, that I kind of freaked out. I mean, I'm not sure he was upset at all, but I was upset with myself. And I'm making a story out of this, but it is the case. I went off campus to this little bookstore, which had it was a bookstore that I don't even remember if it had fiction or was strictly sort of history, philosophy, politics, and economics kinds of stuff. And I had this theory in my, this sort of idea in my head that it was probably owned by some old lefties because it had used in new books, and they were heavily leaning towards critical and left stuff. And I saw on a shelf a book by Eugene Genovese, who was the foremost Marxist historian of the slave South. Later, he would leave behind Marxism, but he always had a
right winger eventually.
Yeah. I mean, that's years later from this. And he and I picked. It was called The Political Economy of Slavery, and I picked it up and I just devoured it, sitting there in the bookstore. And I thought, wow, this is really good, and it gave me ideas for how to approach my dissertation. I'll just say my dissertation on landlord and peasant relations in Spanish America was titled "The Political Economy of Seigniorialism," which was to honor his book. But what happened was it so challenged the work I was, the framework I was using, the theoretical framework, that I wrote to Genovese and I said, here's what I've been doing, and I'm finding myself really frustrated. I saw your Political Economy of Slavery. And between sending the letter and hearing back from him, I just was working my way through, like in a marathon-like way, all of his books. And when he wrote back, he was really blunt. He said, well, for a start, get rid of that Andre Gunder Frank stuff and pick up the British Marxist historians. And he laid out the names. And I didn't have time to work all the way through that kind of stuff, but I sort of reached in and out of it. And I really did come to see the degree to which a Marxian understanding of history was a class struggle analysis, basically. And so where was I going with this? And so this empowered me against sort of the standard thinking about peasants and landlords and so on. It was tough when I came out, as I'm sure you can appreciate, stories about hard times for academic work. When I came out, it was almost impossible to get a job, period. But it didn't help that I was a Marxist from New York, a Jewish Marxist from New York with a PhD from Louisiana. And I would interview at places and I could see the looks on their faces, it was just really remarkable. And eventually I did get a job, but it meant coming back up to the north, obviously. I've been, to make the long story short, I've been in Wisconsin all these, I taught at UW Green Bay for 43 years, and I retired in the face of the pandemic, not wanting to teach online. I like doing this kind of stuff, but I didn't want to lecture to students who had.
No, I'm totally with you on that. I mean, I do. Sometimes I do still take. Teaching is not most of what I do at this point, but this is most of what I do at this point in Jacobin and all that stuff. But but I do still adjunct, and I do still teach some online classes. But I like in-person classes about 10,000 times more because like online teaching basically cuts out the one thing I like about teaching, which is being in the classroom.
Right, exactly. And I thought I might go back to teach a bit in retirement, but the pandemic lasted so long that I just sort of thought, nah, this would be more fun. Well, anyhow, so the jump from doing Latin American studies.
Was also going to say, as somebody who has a PhD from the University of Miami, I can identify with some of what you're saying. But keep going.
No. I mean, one doesn't realize how regionalized things can be. You know, the sort of sense of what's respected and dissed and all that. So by the way, it made me so happy when I finally did get a tenure track job that I basically rarely ever sought to move from out of Wisconsin. I just could not stand the thought of going to a conference with the idea of interviewing. Just even now, I think
it might be. I will actually say, I mean, I think there might also be a sense in which it was really good that you were in Wisconsin all those years in sort of the same way that, like, okay, so somebody who writes about the Marxist theory of history, I know we have disagreements about, G.A. Cohen. I remember thinking at one point, I think I actually said this in an article somewhere, that like whenever I think he has a really bad take, I always think it's like, the man spent too much time at Oxford. Like, he should have, he sort of forgot, the things that he presumably knew growing up in a working class communist family in Montreal. And I think that being in the upper Midwest and particularly being in Wisconsin, which is the site of some like really big labor struggles, even in like the early 2010s, I think probably does help keep you grounded in that way of looking at the world.
Yeah, well, in fact, that's a good point. In fact, I'll come back to the story I was going with and respond to what I just said. I actually always wanted to teach at a place like that like the one I ended up at. Okay. I never wanted to be in a place. I went to all public universities. I never wanted to teach in a place where students or parents thought they could buy and sell me. That was important. Okay. And the other thing was, well, this UW Green Bay, by the way, was set up as an alternative campus of what was the UW system. So what people may wonder, how could you go from Latin America to British, which I'll explain in a moment, and then end up in American studies, for lack of a better term for it. And it's because I was at a school that had an ethos of innovation and experimentation. And though I can't say that anyone else made the leaps that I made, when I really did have 3 academic careers: the graduate study years of Latin America, the early years of my professorial career doing British Marxists and doing a lot of immersion in European history, which I was not trained in. And then in the 90s, throwing myself into my childhood hero, Thomas Paine, and really, really working on American radicalism. People used to joke, what would I do in the 2000s? It's now 30 years since I really threw myself into the sort of American radical stuff. But the jump from Latin America truly into this British Marxist historiography that I knew better then than I know now, but nevertheless, had to do with the fact that I had a really good friend who taught at St. Cloud State University, Minnesota, where I spent 1 year. And he was an Althusserian Marxist in literary criticism. And he and I were best buddies. Even now, I haven't seen him in some years, but I still have the warmest feelings about this. Bill Langan is his name in St. Cloud. And we used to have these really, really great arguments about history versus, what he called historicism versus structuralism, that kind of thing. And he was the organizer. He was like very close friends with Frederick Jameson. And Jameson had asked Bill, would he help organize the Marxist literary group summer institutes? They were like summer camps for Marxist literary folk. And they lasted about 10 days, 2 weeks, I guess 2 weeks. I was there for 10 days that one time. And I was so impressed when he told me about the folks who were coming. They would get people from all over the world. And, the year before I got to St. Cloud, they had Terry Eagleton come to speak there. And then I guess they skipped a year. But the year that he said, Harvey, you got to come back, which was the year I had left and moved to Wisconsin. You got to come back because Stuart Hall was going to speak at the Summer Institute, the summer camp, so to speak. And he was going to talk about this big sort of debate underway in Britain where a younger generation of Marxist social scientists were really, for lack of a better word, really going after the generation of Marxist historians that I had this interest in. And he said, oh, you've got to come and hear Stuart Hall speak. And I thought, absolutely. So I went back to Minnesota, not a big trip, back to Minnesota for the week. And Hall had not yet arrived. And I think it was the July 4th fireworks night. We had all gone. There were like 50 people there at the time for the camp. And afterward, Bill and Fred Jameson and I and another fellow whose name I'm forgetting were sitting at Bill's kitchen table drinking vodka. Bill taught Russian and French, and he always had a bottle of vodka in the freezer. And the phone rang. So this was probably like midnight or even 1 a.m. So in England, it was like 7 o'clock in the morning. The phone rings and it's Stuart Hall, and he's apologizing that he cannot get to the States because budget cuts were taking place. And the Center for Contemporary Cultural Studies at Birmingham, which is where so much of this debate had emerged from, they were receiving cuts, and he couldn't abandon his colleagues before he left. Not left for the States, but left to take up a professorship at the Open University in Britain. And so they hung up the phone, and little was I aware that my friend Bill leaned over to Fred and said, ask Harvey to speak in Stuart's place. Now, I'd never spoken on these. I mean, had I? No, I had not. I had never spoken in public about this stuff. And I had too many vodkas to say no. Okay. And I can't even remember if it was the next day or the day after, because I think I might have had a little time to prepare. It was my turn to speak at 10 a.m. 10 a.m. on that day, or 9 a.m. doesn't matter. But the person who was speaking before me was Gayatri Spivak, who was like the queen of deconstruction. And she was a post-structuralist, and she had just returned from Paris, and she was, talking Derridian theory. And these folks of the Summer Institute, they were all structuralists. They were all Althusserians. And when she spoke that 1 hour, I'm convinced they didn't seem. I don't even think they understood what she was saying. Honestly, I do not think they understood. I can tell you that I definitely did not, but also because I was worried and nervous that when I would speak, that I would have a tough time with the structuralists. So she spoke. They were very polite in their response to her, either because they were afraid of crossing her or because they really didn't quite grasp what was going on. And then I spoke, and I did a straightforward kind of thing, which is, pretty much what I was about. And I can tell you that I don't remember a single question they asked, but I really felt like I had been spat upon en masse at the end of that talk. And when I got up to leave, thinking maybe I should just go home to Wisconsin as quickly as possible, Fred Jameson grabbed me. Keep in mind, Jameson was definitely a sort of a Frankfurt School Marxist, at least in those days. And he grabbed me and said, I really liked your talk. If you write it up, I'd like to publish it in Social Text. I don't know if he was the publisher of Social Text, but the point was he was the godfather of the whole enterprise. Well, I got back to Wisconsin and I spent the year. I didn't really do anything with it. But that summer following, sorry about this long story, but
I love it.
Following, I was accepted into a summer institute of the National Endowment for the Humanities at the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton. And the theme was labor and the Industrial Revolution. And it was chaired by a really fine historian, but one who had made the linguistic turn, Bill Sewell Jr. And when I got there, I was so excited to be there. It was really a great group of people, men and women. Bill made it a point on our first day officially as part of the group to meet with each one of us one by one. And when I met with him, he said to me, would you mind if I propose an alternative to your summer project that you had proposed? And I said, well, sure. He said, well, I know you want to do Welsh labor history readings. And that had to do with the fact that my wife, who was British, her family came out of, one link of her family was in the coal mines of Wales. The other was actually Scottish side of the family. They were carpenters. But he suggested, why don't you, I've heard something about you're doing this British Marxist historians work. Why don't you just write that up this summer? And I thought, wow, that'd be great, because I was already, sort of in the process. And at the end of the summer, when I finished the essay, the paper, and I delivered it to the group, afterward, he pulled me aside. I was young, by the way. I was very young at the time. I was maybe 30 years old, I think it was. In fact, probably. He pulls me aside and he says, that paper is just inadequate. And I said, oh, God, what's wrong? He goes, it really ought to be a book. So I came back to Green Bay, and I was in the library, and on the shelf of the new bookshelves, they had this group of books, Theoretical Traditions in the Social Sciences. And I pulled a few of them off, and they were all being edited, sort of, what do they call them? Sort of series editor, Anthony Giddens, who at the time was the foremost English language social theorist, and he was at Cambridge University. And I thought, wow, I'm going to submit it for publication somewhere, but, I think I'll just send it. I'll ask him, what do you think of this? So I sent it off to the paper to the Canadian Review of Sociology and Anthropology, which eventually did publish it. Didn't they? Yeah, it did. Okay. It's a long time ago. And Tony sent me a letter and said, you'll be hearing from my publisher if you'd like to do a book. And next thing I knew, I had this contract to write this book on the British Marxist historian. So I literally, my work on Latin America is in there. People will see regarding the transition from feudalism to capitalism. If they pick up the book, they'll see that. But what's more significant is that I literally flipped. I just switched. And I spent the 80s and many years after, in certain ways, as the historiographer of the British Marxists. And it really was an adventure, in part because I had to learn things I knew nothing about regarding British history, much of which I've probably forgotten since. But to meet those historians was itself nothing that I had expected to happen. And, so I met Rodney Hilton, the medievalist, Christopher Hill, who's the master of the 17th century, E.P. Thompson, who clearly one of the great, maybe the greatest social historian for my generation. The influence of his one book, The Making of the English Working Class, on my generation is just amazing. And then I ended up also meeting, though this was a few years later, I'll tell quickly, Eric Hobsbawm, who everyone knows, I think, who Eric Hobsbawm is, probably one of the greatest historians of the 20th century, definitely the greatest Marxist historian of the 20th century. I had written to him hoping to meet him, and I thought he would be the one I would connect with the most readily. And it turned out that he would not meet with me. He actually wrote a letter, which I have nearby. And I remember telling people, he basically said I should treat him as if he's dead. And I said that to Eric when I eventually did meet him. He goes, I didn't say that, did I? Said, well, you said I should treat you like Frederick Jackson Turner. Okay. Somebody who I don't have to worry about having any kind of response from. Well, what happened was, in the course of all of this, I also became very close to a historian, George Roudet, okay, who worked both on British history and French history, a really phenomenal figure who taught in Britain, in Australia, and in Canada, and probably the finest teacher of his generation, just remarkable. And I became and to make the long story short, I became the executor of his estate. But George was always very, very, he and Eric Hobsbawm were always very close, very, very close. And I also ended up meeting and ended up editing several of, I shouldn't exaggerate, 3 volumes of his writings. Victor Kiernan, who was part of the group but worked on British imperialism, and then a whole host of other things. And the 2 historians of the group that Hobsbawm remained the closest to in the course of the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s were those 2 historians, Kiernan and Roudet. And they basically told Eric, you have got to meet Harvey. So I did end up meeting Eric, and we stayed in contact till the end of his life. And by the way, Eric, Edward, Christopher, the 3 of them came to Green Bay. They came to the United States to give a lecture tour, so to speak, give lectures. And they came to Green Bay to visit, spoke to my students. They were all remarkable, George Roudet as well. And Hobsbawm and I just, I wish I could have, remember, he and I took a long walk in the woods one afternoon, and we were talking about why he had not sorry, I'm leaving out so much of who these men were. The British Marxist historians basically went to university in the 30s during the Depression and joined the Communist Party.
Yeah,
So
this was originally like the Communist Party historians group.
Right. And then when they returned from the war, they formed the Communist Party historians group, along with a number of other, historians famous and not so famous in the future.
Mm-hmm.
And their ambitions were basically to rewrite the story of England and Britain from, in their words, from a Marxist perspective, from the vantage point of the laboring classes, whether we're talking peasants, artisans, and workers. Okay?
Yeah, the people that, in like Marxist terminology and capital, the immediate producers of any society.
Right, the exploited.
Yeah,
the exploited. Okay?
Exactly. And I remember, actually, I'll just parenthetically say, just because it's so good and it sums up a lot of this impetus so well. You relayed something. I watched some of your conversation with our friends Matt and David on Left Reckoning, and in that conversation, you relayed something that E.P. Thompson, I believe, said to you, which is that basically he liked teaching in America and talking to American students, but sometimes they just asked the dumbest fucking questions. And what was his example of a dumb question? Because I think this really gets to the heart of this.
Yeah. I'll fill it out just a bit and then give you the example. What it is so he was visiting Rutgers he was the first, what was the name of the Swedish ambassador? He was in Hungary during the war and he was rescuing Jews.
Mm-hmm.
I'm blanking out his name, but it was a chair that was created at Rutgers to honor that man. And so we were at dinner and I asked him what he thought, because I went to Rutgers as an undergraduate. What do you think? And he said, well, I much prefer American students to British students because they're so enthusiastic. He really did find that. However, they did ask these dumb fucking questions. And he said, they would ask me who was the king at the time. And he looked at me and he actually said to me, how do I know who the king? It doesn't matter who the king was. It doesn't matter. Now, in fashion, it did matter, obviously.
Sure.
What he was getting at is they were missing the point of his, of how to understand the making of history is what.
Yeah, and I would say, like, one of the things, obviously, I haven't read a fraction of as much of these guys' work as you have, but I remember, I think actually when I was originally reading some of your book from the Rutgers Library, I think it inspired me to track down the Christopher Hill's book, The World Turned Upside Down, about the Civil War. And the way that I mean, it's a little bit, I guess, hard to capture in a short description, but I mean, like the way that it sort of captures these these class dynamics and makes that such a, like within this sort of familiar events, right? If you just kind of want to know about, like, King Charles and Cromwell and what was going on in Parliament, then like there are a million other things that you could read for that, and you should probably read that too. But like there's this entire univerce of sort of undercurrents and kind of motive forces.
Yeah, the English Revolution, because bourgeois. I'm going to use the old terminology from. I don't usually talk this way. Bourgeois historians had always talked about basically the English revolution of like 1688 or something. There was like where, basically they changed dynasties.
The Glorious Revolution,
that kind of. But Christopher Hill basically placed his emphasis, as did many other historians, on the 1640s. And by the way, I mean, it had come to be known before Hill as the Puritan Revolution, as a sort of the Puritan gentry against the aristocracy, that kind of stuff. But what Hill was getting at is the degree to which that there were class dynamics underway, and he wanted to reveal not only the class dynamics, if you like, on the top, okay, or even from the middle and the top, but also from below. And the work you're referring to, The World Turned Upside Down, which it's just a classic. It is just a beautiful classic, because what he shows is that you have in this revolution these different forces, and he reveals the degree to which there are movements, one of which are the levelers. And the levelers basically took the idea of the rights of freeborn Englishmen and made the argument, therefore, freeborn Englishmen should have the right to vote as much as anyone of greater property. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
And then there were the true levelers, aka diggers. Okay.
Yeah. When people were called the levelers, I mean, my understanding is that was kind of an insult. It was like they were being sort of accused of having this view that like the true levelers actually had.
Yeah. Well, leveling, and then the diggers are this other group who thought, well, you can't really have freedom if whether or not you have the right a right to vote if in fact property is unequally distributed. Okay. And they pursued land invasions. Okay. They went out and they just literally, invaded land that was not occupied or that was being left, fallow, and basically land that was held by aristocrats and gentry and others. And they cultivated it. And they even produced their own intellectuals. Gerard Winstanley, who wrote many a treatise on the imperative of, equality. And then then Hill revealed another group, a group which to this day, many an English historian doesn't think actually existed. It was more of a current than a movement or a group, the Ranters. And they went so far as to see God was in everything. Therefore, there ought to be, sexual freedom. It was like a pantheism almost, really. And it's just a fascinating book. One of my peers, though I think he's all the more the finer historian, Marcus Rediker, recently on Twitter was talking about his rediscovery of The World Turned Upside Down. And I just immediately said to him, oh, Marcus, absolutely. It's a read that everyone can be excited by. And I'll just tell everyone, if you don't get excited by it, it may well be because maybe you had to live through the 60s. Maybe, because really, in many ways, I think Hill's idea of writing The World Turned Upside Down was in response to the diverse currents in politics of the 60s. It's just a thought in that way. And so anyhow, I mean, it was an extraordinary experience to do the work. And it really, thereafter, my entire worldview had shifted, really. Mm-hmm. And even to this day, and I hope people can appreciate this. Yeah, so I've written about Thomas Paine, American radicalism, and I've written about FDR and the Greatest Generation. It may sound like, fairly moderate, liberal history, but believe me, if I want you, I'm just posing this as a possibility. If you read even The Fight for the Four Freedoms, okay, it is structured by class struggle. Okay, that to me, and that is the thing. I remember Michael Kazin, a friend who said to me some years ago, he said, "Do you still think yourself as a Marxist?" I said, "I don't think of myself as an ist in any way, but I will forever see the world in terms of class struggle." So that, I mean, how else can we? Sorry, I'm going to make a historic. Please. How the hell could we possibly understand the situation we're in today if we don't appreciate the degree to which we have been living through what Ralph Miliband, the great Marxist political scientist and a very dear friend of the men that I wrote about, said we have been, he wrote this in the late 80s, 70s. Wait a minute, let me get late 70s. He was already talking about class struggle from above. It may well be that the struggle has been, if you like, enervated from below, but it sure as hell has been pursued. How do you get the transfer of wealth? How do you get the expropriation, that's transpired in these last 45 to 50 years and fail to see that as class war on working people, right? I mean, it's inconceivable.
Well, yeah. I mean, and I think that actually to just, and I do want to eventually circle back and hear that story about Eric Hobsbawm we did get, but they have but I mean, I think that, I think a lot of times what we're talking about in that case is one-sided class struggle, which is the problem, right? Because you have, I mean, obviously, electoral politics is only one small part of that. But I mean, like thinking about electoral politics for a second here, and sort of zooming back to America in 2022, something that I know that you and I agree about is that it's sort of a little much the way that everybody has been doing victory laps and
God, yeah.
spraying each other with champagne to celebrate.
Yeah, that's a tragic comic laugh that I just made.
Only losing a little bit to people who openly said, Bronco March Teach wrote about this for the Nation, for Jacobin. I interviewed him about it. My college show, like if you read Kevin McCarthy's Commitment to America document that he put out before the election, he openly announces his intention to steal people's Social Security money. I mean, that's not the way he puts it, but I mean, I think that's what it amounts to in practice. And the fact that you only lost a little bit in the House of Representatives to these people is not really the great accomplishment that it's been made out to be. And I think that what I would say about that is that I think with honorable exceptions, that, I think some of what like Fetterman was doing in Pennsylvania, et cetera, like I think that Democrats were really not willing to, they've been structurally unable to appeal to popular rage in the ways that they should have, given everything that's been going on. I mean, that the fact that the fact that there was this openly announced and plan to cut Social Security and Medicare. I mean, they kind of started talking about that in the last days, before the election, but they didn't really make that an issue. That wasn't anything like the centerpiece. The fact that inflation was allowed to be, like Republicans pretty much got a corner on talking about that, even though you had this outrageous situation where CEOs would tell investors in earnings calls that they were making record profits and it had never been better, at the same time that they were gouging people at the gas pump and the grocery store. I think I think all of that says something about how one-sided it's been, that there isn't really the pushback there should be.
Yeah, I mean, can you still hear me?
I can still hear you.
Yeah, I mean, I all I can think of is every time I think about what transpired this past election year, this midterm year, is that Nancy Pelosi invested more of her political capital in crushing Jessica Cisneros in Texas than I mean, the Democrats spend more energy crushing progressives than they really put into fighting the Republicans. When you look at exactly what you said, their utter failure to speak in political economic terms. Okay. Mm-hmm. And look, and people say to folks who are centrists or whatever, they'll say, well, what would you have had them do? Mm-hmm. And I was like, well, how about this? How about for a start, they start calling out the big corporations that have been jacking up their prices. One, Joe Biden, why didn't he call together the heads of the major oil companies in his office and read them the Riot Act and say, I'm issuing an executive order setting a standard price for petroleum. Okay. I mean, that's the kind of stuff I would have expected. And by the way, there's nothing about what I just said, which is necessarily, he doesn't even have to say I'm a socialist now because there's nothing socialist about it. FDR did it. Hell, Richard Nixon is raising price controls. Okay.
I mean, absolutely. Yeah.
Show people that you're not just, you claim to be the working man's president, union, a friend of the unions. Well, show you're truly a friend and ally by lining up with them and making people's lives all the better. By the way, sorry, I'm going to stop after this thing. How the hell do you pass an what was it called? The act that first passed, the American Rescue Plan, mm-hmm. and then have the child tax credit and brag about the fact that you're going to cut childhood poverty in half. By the way, I used to say, I couldn't help but say, well, why stop at a half? What?
Yeah, right. we're gonna leave the other half, but that's
right. We're gonna screw the other half, right? and then only do it for, and then allow the bill to go through for as a 1 year. 1 year. I mean, what kind of Democrats?
We're going to take care of half of it for a year, and then then it'll be back. But
Right,
you got a
then
nice
we
year
can
off.
reunite them in poverty, right?
Right.
The mind boggles. And then now to do victory laps, okay, when in fact you're going to lose the House of Representatives, you're going to lose the House, and what do you expect to the next 2 years to be like? Wait until the recession hits some point, and then you can be guaranteed that Ron DeSantis is going to be your next president. Bam.
Yeah. No, I think unfortunately there is an excellent chance of that, which is terrifying. I think that because I suspect that unfortunately he'd be more competent than Trump.
Yeah. So back to Hobsbawm. All right.
Yeah. Let's do Hobsbawm before we go to the post game. What were you going to say about Hobsbawm?
Okay. So the thing so when Hobsbawm was here, we had lunch in London. We already knew each other. He came. It was really great. But we spent this afternoon. Well, we spent a day out in Door County. You know Door County, having grown up on the other side of the lake in Michigan, right?
Mm-hmm.
That's the thumb of Wisconsin that heads north. And we were out for the day. I took him to lunch. We did this long walk in the woods, and we got into this discussion. I worked up the courage to say, Eric, why did you not leave the Communist Party when everyone of your closest comrades did in the wake of the Soviet invasion of Hungary and the revelations of Stalin? And he went, and later, eventually, he does write about this in a memoir, his book, his autobiography. But it really was that he began by telling me what it was like to be on the streets in Germany, where he was living at the time, and being attacked as a leftist and a Jew by Nazis. And the solidarities that one had amongst young radicals. Later, the solidarities that existed in the party. I mean, there's this sense of loyalty that he had to a tradition that just he could not separate himself from that sense of loyalty. And I remember afterward we went for I guess it was a long morning walk, and then we went for lunch, a late lunch up there. And I said to him, Eric, I have to tell you, I wish I could have recorded what you were saying because, and I said, not for the sake of the CIA or anything like that, but because I would like to go back and think about what you said. And he said, I wish we had recorded it too, because it would help me if I ever do decide to write a memoir. And, I can tell you that I disagreed with him, utterly disagreed with him on that question, because I was much closer to Thompson on that question.
Mm-hmm.
But I will also tell you, when I asked Dorothy Thompson, Edward's wife, who was also a historian, why they didn't leave the party in 1940 when Hitler-Stalin Pact was signed, she answered in similar kinds of ways about loyalty to the party, et cetera, et cetera. So Eric, in his own way, was just merely sort of the later rendition of what they had said. But the Thompsons and others had really just were ready to go, and they left the party, and they remained socialists, okay, and in many ways Marxists, especially when you read their work of the 60s and beyond. But they would no longer have anything to do specifically with the Communist Party. So.
Yeah, and I think also, I mean, we actually watched on this channel with Cuba Warinsky. I watched. We do these Thursday night debate breakdowns. We watched this Oxford Union debate between Thompson and Caspar Weinberger, which is like a weird thing that existed.
Oh, yeah, wow.
And yeah, exactly. So and Thompson, is obviously, this is like the 80s. Thompson is long past his CP involvement, but he's still not only is he still a leftist, I mean he's still very firmly opposed to sort of Cold War hawkery, and and it's a good debate on his end, but yeah, I think that there's an interesting question, and maybe this is where we'll pick things up in the post game. There are also a few other strands of what you said I want to kind of pick back up on. about how, look, you and I agree that the I think about a sort of baseline, democratic socialist critique of, capital C communism, but that I think that maybe there's something about that they sort of had to come from some tradition like that in order to do what they were doing. That they, in other words, that it's like if they were just creatures of academia, there wasn't this external movement that that could command that kind of internal camaraderie and all of that stuff that they were part of, then they might not have been able to do what they were doing in their historical research. So I want to hear your thoughts about that when we pick back up. So
that is a good question, because I will tell you, and anyone who's not a patron, become one. Okay, that is a good question because of what happened to George Rude, who had not gotten into academe before the Cold War set in. Okay.
Yeah. Okay. So I definitely want to pick that up. So yeah, if you are a patron, you should already have an email with the link for the post game. If you are not one, I want to just remind you that you get that patron exclusive post game after the main episodes every week. You get the Discord server. Sometimes you do interviews that you get advanced access to. But most importantly, it's an act of solidarity. If you like what we're doing here, it helps us helps it to keep going. So please do consider that. But we're going to be back in a minute with Harvey J. Kaye, with Andy, and with Cale Brooks, who's also going to be joining us for that. So we're going to be back for that in just a minute. Left is best.